Sharyl Attkisson speaks on C-SPAN's Washington Journal about Benghazi. The interview is 45 minutes long. If you are like me, you'll find it riveting from start to finish. I only wish it were longer, as Sharyl is a veritable wealth of knowledge on the topic of Benghazi. Also, note that ABC News reported the Benghazi talking points were revised 12 times. And during ABC's investigation, they discovered that the brother of CBS's news president was Obama's deputy national security advisor and was instrumental in changing the Benghazi talking points. Sharyl Attkisson works for CBS. Get the picture? This woman is a true paragon of journalistic courage.
Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome back Sharyl Attkisson, investigative reporter for CBS News. Good morning. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
A busy week here in Washington, and I want to begin with the reporting of Benghazi from Politico. There are 5 takeaways, and number 1, Hillary Clinton is now more than just a subtext. Is that one of the storylines from this past week?
I think so. There's been a lot of focus, for example, on the changing versions of the talking points, but at the heart of the changes, the primary ones instigated the evening before the main ones were changed, were from her press spokesman. She was, of course, at the time Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, and her press spokesman was very aggressive in these email exchanges as to what she did and didn't like. And primarily they, as people now know, scrubbed all references to terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic extremists out of those talking points.
So what did she know about this? And the other question is, when did she know about it? Because as we heard from Gregory Hicks, the phone call that night that she received, and that was, of course, 5-6 days before Susan Rice was on the Sunday morning programs.
We have a slowly building body of evidence that I think suggests that pretty much all the parties knew from the very outset, not only knew but believed this was likely an extreme Islamic extremist terrorist attack, both here and also possibly in Cairo. Something I learned through looking at the talking point versions this week was a question I have, I guess I should say, is, was the Cairo attack in fact inspired by a YouTube video? We now, nobody believes or nobody is saying that the Benghazi attack was any longer, but if you look at the talking points before they were changed, they reference a CIA warning that went out September 10th that specifically said they had intelligence that Islamic extremists were encouraging demonstrators and jihadists to break into the embassy in Cairo as well. So if we had a heads up of that at least the day before, as well as the Benghazi incidents, were either of these incidents really inspired by the YouTube video?
Well, let me share with you what the Secretary of State said on September the 14th. Again, this is on Friday. Susan Rice made her appearance on Sunday the 16th. And listen carefully to how she parsed the statement as delivered at Andrews Air Force Base.
This has been a difficult week for the State Department and for our country. We've seen the heavy assault on our post in Benghazi that took the lives of those brave men. We've seen rage and violence directed at American embassies over an awful internet video that we had nothing to do with. It is hard for the American people to make sense of that because it is senseless. And it is totally unacceptable. The people of Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Tunisia did not trade the tyranny of a dictator for the tyranny of a mob. Reasonable people and responsible leaders in these countries need to do everything they can to restore security and hold accountable those behind these violent acts.
Sharyl Attkisson, 2 things. First of all, the Secretary of State separating what happened in Benghazi and then tying in the other demonstrations in Egypt and elsewhere to the YouTube video. And the storyline coming within the 24 hours after the attacks, because both things were essentially happening simultaneously.
Well, I would like to know where the YouTube video attribution came from, because now we're getting, again, this building body of evidence that really nobody on the ground that we've spoken to, State Department officers and diplomats and so on, ever said that they thought it was, based on a protest or YouTube video. So it seems to me, as I look to solve the puzzle of what happened and what was being said, it looks like somebody developed a storyline very quickly, perhaps even that night right after these attacks occurred, although the bulk of the evidence suggested what we now know, that this was act of terrorism and pre-planned. It seems as though somebody decided to guide the American public's viewpoint toward that YouTube video. And one very specific piece of evidence on that is when some of the family members came to see the bodies of their loved ones, brought back here, at least 2 of the members were told by Mrs. Clinton, they say, we're going to get the person who made that awful video. And I wondered at the time, why didn't she say, we're going to get the terrorists who killed your son, or we're going to get the people who killed your son? Even if a video were at play, assuming for the sake of argument, why would you be after the maker of the video more so than the people who committed the murders? But it seems like there was a storyline that was being advanced.
Gregory Hicks, his testimony this past week, and some sidebar stories that he's been demoted, he's been given a desk job. What do you know about him?
Gregory Hicks is a very devoted public servant, a lifelong government foreign service worker who was quite enamored of Hillary Clinton for much of his time, really respected a lot of her until all of this. He's changed his opinion dramatically in the aftermath of the Benghazi attacks because he feels like things were misrepresented, and when he tried to set things straight, as you said, he was marginalized and demoted. I think he's had a tough go of it. He's been quietly, dealing with this on his own for many months, and it took a lot of courage for him to step forward because, as we always know, life is made very tough for people who step out of line and tell their stories like this.
So let me share with you and with our audience just part of the exchange. This is with Congressman Jim Jordan before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the hearing that took place this past week. All of it, by the way, available on our website at cspan.org.
It seems to me that it came to a head in phone calls you were on with lawyers from the Department of State prior to Congressman Chaffetz coming to visit in Libya. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about those conversations, what those lawyers instructed you to do on Mr. Chaffetz's visit to Libya.
I was instructed not to allow the RSO, the acting deputy chief of mission, and myself to be personally interviewed by Congressman Chaffetz.
So Sharyl Attkisson, is this the beginning of a series of hearings? Could there be a select committee? And what do Democrats do?
Well, a lot of this depends, of course, on the mood of Congress, changes from day to day, their level of interest and so on. Right now there is some momentum. I think we will have future hearings. The Democrats are in a tough position. I think even some Democrats, well, they've said so, that they agree there are questions to be answered. There's some disturbing things about this, but they also have to, politically, I think they're in damage control mode. They're looking for other ways to deflect some of the blame and fault that's going on here so this doesn't take on a life of its own and really do some serious damage to the political party and to the Obama administration.
Hollis is our first caller from Falls Church, Virginia, independent line. Good morning. Actually, we'll go to Patricia next in Minneapolis. Good morning.
Good morning. I can't believe it says investigative correspondent. This story should have been investigated, and no one but the press and liberals believed that nonsense about the video. I can't believe that you're just now talking about it. You avoided this story like the plague because you wanted Obama to get reelected. This story came out in September. And also, no one is talking about the fact that this poor
Patricia,
man...
I got to jump in because one of the reasons why we have Sharyl Attkisson on is that she was one of the very first to report some of the inconsistencies.
But I mean the station, too. The station.
Well, that's not true. Well,
let me speak to
okay.
that. CBS was very aggressive. I think people either didn't notice at the time or have forgotten that we did quite a great deal of coverage, especially in the October time frame when after I'd been assigned to look into the story, we broke some major news, including I interviewed Colonel Andrew Wood, the lieutenant colonel whose team was pulled out of Benghazi despite requests for it to stay, the military team that was providing additional security. And we've definitely been on the story. I think people now are paying more attention to it, and for some reason think CBS is only now picking up on it, which is not the case.
And of course we're focusing on it today because of the hearing that took place this past week, but we've been dealing with this issue as well since the initial reports on September the 11th and September the 12th. But thanks for the call. Representative Elijah Cummings is the ranking Democrat. He says this whole thing is political. Here's what he had to say. And we'll come back to Representative Cummings in just a moment. We'll go to our next caller, which is Bill from Lyme, Connecticut. Democrats line, good morning.
Good morning. I was wondering about the Hicks testimony. There was some conflicting stuff coming from that, in that he, when he said that he was demoted and all that stuff, and then they talked to the people in his office and they had complaints about him, and in fact the matter was, in the hearing itself, he said he did it for family reasons. I mean, where was he telling the truth?
Well, I think anyone who thinks a man could go from the #2 position at the dangerous post in Libya, of a diplomatic post, and suddenly find himself assigned to a desk job over something he really preferred not to have, and that's a result of any sort, the timing is purely coincidental. That doesn't seem, credible to me. That's not his view either. I think when you're on the inside, you know what's happening to you when you're starting to ask questions and the clampdown begins. But you can judge for yourself if you think he is indeed somehow, tainted, or that's up to you to decide. I don't think that, just based on the knowledge I have, but you're free to think that.
And here is Representative Elijah Cummings again from this past week at the House Government Reforms Committee. He is the ranking Democrat on that committee.
Seen over the past 2 weeks is a full-scale media campaign that is not designed to investigate what happened in a responsible and bipartisan way, but rather a launch of unfounded accusations to smear public officials. Let me be clear. I am not questioning the motives of our witnesses. I am questioning the motives of those who want to use their statements for political purposes. Chairman Issa has accused the administration of intentionally withholding military assets, which could have helped save lives on the night of the attacks. I say for political reasons. Of all the irresponsible allegations leveled over the past 2 weeks, this is the most troubling. And based on what our military commanders have told us, this allegation is simply untrue.
So, Sharyl Attkisson, that gives you a sense of the political side of all of this from Democrats on Capitol Hill.
Well, I think we're past the days, if we ever had them, where a political party accused of mismanagement or wrongdoing can accuse the other without being called political. I mean, are we at the point where if either party does something perhaps wrong, when questions are asked, that they're immediately dismissed as political? Of course, there's a political element to these sorts of things, but I think the Democrats are in a tough spot because they know there are some legitimate issues here. They do want to steer people into the idea that there's an agenda here, or that this is all political, because really they can't argue with some of the facts that don't look good and a lot of the unanswered questions.
The follow-up to all of this from the Wall Street Journal, Speaker Boehner now demanding emails, anything related to Benghazi. Clearly there's a paper trail that needs to be investigated further.
Yeah, eight months in, good, but there has been a lot of discussion among Republicans on the Hill. They're not in full agreement. They're not marching together with the ideas of what they ought to do. Some of the leadership haven't wanted to pursue this issue heavily, while some of the rank-and-file committees and some in the Senate have been pushing to do so. It'll be interesting to see if they come together more with a cohesive approach now that this has picked up some steam after the hearings last week.
If you're just tuning in, or if you're listening on C-SPAN Radio, our guest is Sharyl Attkisson, investigative reporter for CBS News. Her work is also available online at cbsnews.com. You and others have been reporting on this RNC ad that did not air back in 2012, but let's watch it.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world.
You're an investigative reporter, not a political reporter, but any sense of why that didn't air? And what's interesting is that was put together back in mid-September, and the questions that they raised back then, same questions being posed this past week.
You're right, I'm not a political reporter specifically, and I don't have any insight on that. You can only presume when an ad like that is produced and not run that they did some sort of polling on how this issue would play, and they decided it was going to work against them more than working for them.
Bill Kristol in the Weekly Standard, inaction and deception, having failed thoroughly to review what happened. The board, this is referring to that independent review board looking into Benghazi, produced a report that was somewhere between radically incomplete and positively misleading. Now, the White House keeps referring to this review board chaired by Ambassador Thomas Pickering, and yet a lot of holes already in that document. Yes, so Mr. Pickering will be on Face the Nation a little later today, so I'm sure he's going to be asked some questions about that on CBS. But there are some questions. They had it's my understanding they had a mission that was limited in scope by definition. I'm not sure that was clear to the public at the time. They have only certain authorities. They didn't interview some people. I don't think they interviewed all the military officials on the rescue attempts, and yet drew some conclusions in their report nonetheless about what could and couldn't happen without necessarily speaking to all the people on the ground who might know the answers. So yeah, I think there are some questions to be asked. Congress does want to call the authors of the ARB back and ask them some of these things and see how thorough the review was. And we should point out you're also going to be on Face the Nation as well later this morning, so we'll be watching, and we can also hear your program on C-SPAN radios Sunday afternoons at beginning at noon Eastern time. John is joining us, West Palm Beach, Florida. Democrats line with Sharyl Attkisson of CBS News. Good morning.
Good morning. Two things that I think people are missing is the CIA report seems to indicate that we were warned, and I'm amazed that more of that is not being brought out. And the second thing is preparedness. This is Libya. This is a dangerous country, and for years, the military, since I was growing up in the 60s, they scramble, right? You're supposed to get those chips up in 10 minutes. And also, there should be a war game, a preparedness, a contingency plan. And for, Cummings to say, well, the military leaders told us they couldn't get there. How could they not get there? This is Libya. There was no plan. It's just like 9/11. After the first plane hit, they knew, it wasn't being reported, but they knew, the intelligence community knew that there were other planes up there, and the jets were scrambled late then. And I know this is I'm bringing in the Columbia thing, but, we go into space, we have a hole in the wing, we don't have sensors on the wings, we don't have the capability to do a spacewalk. There's a link here where the government it's falling down. I just don't understand why we're not prepared for these things to go in and to save these people.
Okay, John, thanks for the call.
I think he's hit on these are my lists of unanswered questions, some of them, and you've hit on two key points. One of them, the warnings. It appeared as though, especially from the early versions of the talking points, the CIA and Petraeus had issued warnings and, in essence, done that part of the job, and that immediately, according to email exchanges, the State Department was worried that information would be used to blame them, that the American public might say, why didn't you heed the warnings, and why did you draw back on security? I would love to hear, I don't know if he'll ever speak publicly about this, but I would love to hear more from Petraeus, because as I reported in an article I wrote, I believe on Friday, there's an email exchange with him where he seemed very discouraged by the talking points. He was sent the final versions, and he said something like, well, he's being told basically that they cut out a lot of information that he had approved to be in there, most of it about the CIA having done their job and provided early warnings to these things. And he said something like, well, I just assume they not use them. This is not what the Hill asked for when they wanted these briefing talking points. And then he commented, they won't even let us tell them about the warning to Cairo, meaning they had wiped out from the talking points the fact that there'd been a heads up at Cairo as well. From the preparedness viewpoint, I think that's a huge issue still. The administration and the ARB both say nothing more could have been done. Everything was tried. But I continue to have a constant stream of special forces and extremist folks, others who know that world in that region, and insist that they do have forces ready to move quickly, that that's their job, that there's millions of dollars spent to keep them on alert. They say they should have been moved and could have been moved. That's at odds with the administration's account, but I still think there's more information to be had.
Let's go back to the talking points, because that really has become a source of contention. Who wrote that document? Who signed off on it? And when did it get to Susan Rice?
I don't think we know all the answers. We still don't have the constant trail, and there's a dark hole during the deputies' meeting on September 15th, which I think was a Saturday morning after these talking points were being developed on a Friday. The White House has not said who was at the deputies' meeting. We can assume, obviously, top deputy officials in the relevant agencies. There was some confusion Friday, which is another sort of red flag to me as an investigative reporter, whereby the State Department was insisting all day that I believe Hillary Clinton's former deputy chief of staff, Jake Sullivan. There was a lot of talk about he was not at the deputies' meeting, insistence that he was not there. The press officer from State Department was saying that's bogus, and even the White House will tell you he wasn't there. Late in the day, the White House issued a statement saying Jake Sullivan was there. I found that very strange. We went back to the State Department, and the spokesman said, yes, oh, my bad, I hadn't asked Jake before I answered the question. So why did the State Department go from insisting one of their top deputies was not at this big talking points meeting? Why did the White House then contradict them? I think, again, there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
I'm not sure if you saw White House Press Secretary Jay Carney on Friday, but he insists again that the only changes that they made was changing the word consulate to be a diplomatic post, and that was it. It was just a factual point, but nothing else.
I think he said he and the State Department, that's the only change they made. I think when you talk to these people, what I've learned is you have to really watch the words they use. They did not hold the pen in hand and literally wipe the changes themselves. But clearly, I think it's disingenuous to claim that they did not instigate, approve, and take part in these changes. Clearly, they did. I also think parsing, while it's important to know who exactly did what, in general, we now know the basic thing, which is the Obama administration, whoever it was, drastically changed these talking points, pointed America toward a video when there was no real, tangible, hard evidence that that was the case, and didn't convene, for example, their counterterrorism security group the night during the attacks, which is required by presidential directive. They haven't explained to the satisfaction of some people involved in that world why they wouldn't call up their counterterrorism experts as required so that things could be coordinated.
So why? Why would the White House or the State Department want to hide the facts? Why not simply come out and say, yes, this was an act of terrorism, we're going to get these individuals?
It's hard to say. We were something like 8 weeks before an election. I'm sure, as any party would be, Democrat or Republican, facing a crisis of some sort, that they immediately went into manage this issue mode. Obviously, they wanted to handle it in the best way they could, substantively, but they also were thinking about how this would play to the public, what this could do as an election issue. So I guess those two things were converging, and it's just hard to say why they went with one narrative versus another, and would things have been better if they had simply told the fuller part of the story, if they had put out the talking points as originally planned, or would that indeed have exploded on President Obama before the election? As
you well know, your appearance here this morning generated a lot of attention on the Twitter feeds. This is one from one of our viewers saying, news reports say that you were being pressured by CBS bosses to back down on the Benghazi story. What can you tell us?
No one has spoken to me about the Benghazi story, pressuring me one way or the other. And in fact, our executives, the ones I consider executives, our CEO, Jeff Fager, our president, David Rhodes, have been encouraging in general of the kind of reporting I do. There's a diverse range of views and opinions within CBS News on the broadcasts among the producers who run the various broadcasts. And it's hard to explain on a given day why they think something is news versus something else. They have a lot of stories to choose from, and that's their prerogative. So there is often a lot of discussion about what best serves the public in those broadcasts. But I have not directly received any executive pressure to stop doing the Benghazi story.
Do you feel you have editorial freedom to do the stories you want, both on CBS News and the CBS News website?
I do. I have a lot of editorial freedom, but it doesn't mean anybody will air the pieces. I mean, all the reporters come up with their own stories, and then you have to basically shop them to a broadcast and find a broadcast that wants a home for them. That's harder at some times than it is at others. Generally for the web, that's an easy sell because they want content and they don't have a lot of time constraints. They don't have to make a lot of choices. Sometimes it's more difficult with the other broadcasts.
Let me share with you, as you have read the Washington Post profile of our guest, Sharyl Attkisson. She has been a persistent voice of news media skepticism about the government's story. On the air and online, Attkisson questions the administration's timeliness in response. Her general approach to her work may be spelled out in her self-description on her own Twitter account. Investigative journalist, dreaming of a day when public officials answer questions as if they know they work for the public.
I think one of the things that working in Washington has aggravated me when trying to get to the truth, and this is true across administrations, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they seem to have lost sight of the fact that they work for us, not the other way around. And I think we, the public, are owed a lot of information collected and gathered on our behalf, such as information floating around about Benghazi, and it's guarded by the holders and the keepers of the information as if they somehow own it and hold the privilege over you that you can't see it. For example, freedom of information requests that I've made, that act has now been used instead of to facilitate the release of obviously public information, which was its intention. It's now, in my opinion, been used to withhold and delay the release of public information. I get pretty much zero response. That didn't start in the Obama administration. He seems to have perfected it, he and the federal agencies, but this was true also under George Bush. It's very difficult to get public information through, even when you apply the Freedom of Information law.
Will you be staying at CBS News?
Well, time will tell. I'm here today, I'm there tomorrow, and I have a home there, I think, as long as I wish to have a home there.
Jimmy is joining us next from Abilene, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I was just curious. Since the Petraeus scandal, I haven't heard anywhere else anyone mention the fact that Paula Broadwell had made the comment, and I can't be the only one to have seen the video, that there were insurgents being held by intelligence somewhere there down the street, across the street, somewhere close to the ambassador's location, and that that's what the people were trying to do, was recover the people that were being held. And if that's the case, if I'm not mistaken, there was an executive order issued by Obama that there were to be no more people held at black sites like that. But since that scandal broke, none of that's come to light.
I did look into that to the extent that I was able to, and 2 points on that. I've talked to some sources I have there. I don't have the whole story, but the ones I spoke to were not aware of anyone being held as described. And part two, to your point that the United States is not supposed to do that sort of thing, I was also told by sources that sometimes if something like that is done, we could be using, maybe you would call it a loophole, where we would be using local forces to actually do the holding. So we could say that they're not really in U.S. control. Again, I haven't been able to find out whether that's true or not, but the people I have spoken to weren't aware of anybody being held.
And you have how many questions on that list there, by the way? Have you counted?
I think there are over 25 questions on the list. Important questions, key questions, I think.
Do you want to go through some of them?
Sure. Just the first one. When was Ambassador Stephen's body recovered? What are the known details surrounding his disappearance and death, including where he was taken, found, transported, and by whom? 8 months later, we have virtually no information on how he died, what time he was found, where his body was taken. There was confusion over whether he was at a hospital or not. Was he dead or alive at that point? Did the hospital, there was a phone call made on his phone to the embassy where someone speaking Arabic said, he's here, and there's the feeling, Greg Hicks testified to this week, that maybe the people at the hospital, which was controlled by what they would call the bad guys there, were trying to lure a rescue attempt. So they chose not to go to the hospital to try to recover him dead or alive at that time because they sent some sort of trap. But we just know very little about that. I think that's strange. Who made the decision not to convene the counterterrorism security group the night of the Benghazi attacks, which we understand is a protocol under presidential directive NSPD 46? Why was the protocol not followed? I've gotten a partial answer to that from the White House before they quit talking to me altogether. And they just said they felt it wasn't needed, that all the proper advisors on counterterrorism were in the mix. Now that differs with the people who are actually on the counterterrorism security group who say, hey, we're the ones that should have been on the phone, interagency. We would have been able to get resources mobilized. We're the ones that can tell the principals exactly what's out there. And I know for a fact some of the principals who are making these decisions, either they weren't being truthful with me or they don't know about all the resources, because we discussed on the telephone when I asked them why certain resources weren't used, and they indicated they'd never heard of such a thing. They didn't know the terms I was using. Later when I came back to them, they said, oh, yes, we do know the terms. I mean, they just seemed confused. Well, those counterterrorism experts know all of that. They know where people are placed, and they insist they would have been able to coordinate some sort of response that perhaps would have been better than what we had.
So if you call the White House, if you send an email to the communications office, do they respond at all?
No, not now.
There's this from Laura who says, why didn't the White House just refrain from commenting until they knew something rather than going on with this video?
That's another good question. They after the talking points revision story came out this week, I believe as the State Department issued continuing explanations as to why that was. And among the explanations, they again said they didn't want to jeopardize the investigation and they didn't want to make ties to things that were tenuous. But in rejecting the ties to the terrorists, which were actually the strongest, most valid leads they had, and instead hanging on to ties to something that I saw little to no evidence of, they were even more so clinging to ties that were tenuous. So that didn't make a lot of sense to me.
In your career, you've certainly followed the story of Ronald Reagan's Iran-Contra investigation and, of course, Bill Clinton's own impeachment. Is the White House digging itself into a hole? Are they continuing to use different barriers to get the full story out?
It's hard to say where this goes. You know, it's hard to say if the media loses interest tomorrow, it all, you know, may quietly go away again. If Congress doesn't pursue it or decides that it's not good for them politically to keep hammering away on it, it could just kind of fade away like it has off and on over the past 8 months. I don't know how big this becomes for the Obama administration or for Mrs. Clinton.
Andy is joining us, Fairfax, Virginia, Republican line with Sharyl Attkisson of CBS News. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning. Hey, I'm really curious of the coverage of this, that nobody's really looking at the other side of the coin. That when you stand back and look at the picture, you have a North African oil-exporting country that we, together with the French and the British, have recently destabilized. And was it a political or military decision that we did not have assets there, or for that matter, that the British or the French didn't? It's a little bit reminiscent of the Suez Crisis.
Well, you have to assume that it's true that we had no assets there. I'm not sure that's been firmly decided by all people concerned, although that is definitely the claim. And there are, as you say, a lot of energy concerns there. I don't pretend to understand all of those, but there has been some discussion of part of the motivation of us getting involved to overthrow Gaddafi could have been, according to some people who work on the ground there, motivated in part by other concerns such as, I think there was a natural gas pipeline that Libya was getting ready to join that involved the Russians that could possibly threaten the supply to Europe and things like that that I can't say I know a lot about. But it was explained to me, as you said, that there could be a lot of other things at play as to why we went into Libya besides the reasons, you know, the obvious reasons.
As you know, 2 months after General Petraeus, the CIA director, was critical of the White House and the State Department for scrubbing the talking points memo, he's out of a job. Any connection between the two?
Well, I've always wondered. I mean, you would be brain dead if you didn't wonder if there was a connection. And now that I've seen how unhappy he seemed to be in emails after the talking points were changed, within a fairly short period of time for him to come up without a job. Also, right before he lost his job, his agency had promised to release the surveillance video at Benghazi, which has never been released, but we were supposed to get a declassified version. And by him being ousted, we never got that. And that's one of my questions on the list. Let's see what number it is. Just asking for additionally, CBS has repeatedly requested the promised surveillance video, but it has not been provided. And we also filed a Freedom of Information Act request for that, which hasn't been responded to. So why was that video deemed a version that could be seen by the public around the November timeframe, and why has it never been released, coincident with Petraeus being ousted from office? One more question about Petraeus. Wondering about the timing. There's a reference to the president speaking to General Petraeus or the administration Thursday, November 8th, 2012, about his problems in the sexual scandal. One of my questions has been, was the president aware of Petraeus's potential problems prior to the date that the administration first made Petraeus aware that they knew? What I'm getting at there is, did Petraeus have this hanging over his head for how long did he have it hanging over his head that the administration knew something very embarrassing about him and were for the moment keeping it quiet? And was that any sort of incentive on his part? Perhaps not, but was that any sort of incentive for him to fall in line on something maybe he didn't fully agree with?
Will General Petraeus respond to any questions? Have you tried?
I have not tried. I just started thinking about him again on Friday when I saw the email. I think it's, you know, I doubt he'll pick up the phone and talk to me if I call, but I do think we ought to make the effort.
Nora is joining us from the Bronx in New York. Good morning, Democrats line.
Yes, good morning. I think this Benghazi hearings that was conducted on the Hill is a farce.
Why is that?
Instead of looking for not only what happened, but how we could not have this happen again. And I'd like to throw out to the reporter there. There was over 10 embassies or diplomatic attacks under George Bush, and about 60 people were killed. I never heard all this outrage when George Bush was president. He fooled the American people and took us to war, which drained our economy. You know, and all this with President Obama and bringing up now Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State, to me, it's more political than really getting at the truth. The Republicans cut the aid to diplomatic security, but nobody is questioning or saying anything about that. That should be investigated also.
I think that has been discussed. I've heard it discussed, and it was brought up at the hearing repeatedly and brought up early on as far as the funding questions. And again, the caller's free to believe this is entirely political and to believe that Mrs. Clinton should be kept out of it. That's your prerogative as a reporter. I see her as key to this issue simply because of the position she held at the time this happened. But if you don't think so, it's okay.
If she runs, clearly this is going to be the first line of questioning when she sits down with reporters. What's your question to her?
Wow. I think I would like to have her, this isn't so much a question as a dialogue, describe everything that happened that night from start to finish, and the night of the attacks, more so than the security. I'm somewhat interested in the security, although we've had some of those questions answered. I really want to know. We don't know President Obama's actions the night of the attack. We don't have a lot of information about hers. I'd like to have the timeline from start to finish on that. And also, I guess if I had a single question, can you show us the evidence that you used to develop your speeches and stories and discussions about the YouTube video? One question I asked the White House related to that is about the video. I think these are really interesting questions that may be a half step off of the main point, but is the administration's reported to have asked that the anti-Islamist YouTube video be removed from YouTube. If true, what is the administration's view regarding other videos or future material that it may wish were not published but are nonetheless legal? Also, when Mrs. Clinton told the family members she would find and arrest whoever made the anti-Islam video, if she indeed said that, what was her understanding at the time of what would be the grounds for arrest? If someone made a perfectly legal video that is offensive to some people, what was her idea in her head of why she would be and how she would be arresting this person? Those questions haven't been answered.
Scott Desjardins is a Republican from Tennessee, also on the panel that questioned Greg Hicks this past Wednesday. Here's a portion of that hearing.
Following my return to the United States, I attended Chris's funeral in San Francisco, and then I came back to Washington. Assistant Secretary Jones summoned me to her office, and she delivered a blistering critique of my management style. And she even said, I exclaimed, "I don't know why Larry Pope would want you to come back." And she said she didn't even understand why anyone at Tripoli would want me to come back.
But yet, right after the attack and before the attack, you had all kinds of praise for your leadership. You got a call from Secretary Clinton. You got a call from the President praising you for your service and how you handled things. Was there a seminal moment in your mind to when all this praise and appreciation turned into something else?
In hindsight, I think it began after I asked the question about Ambassador Rice's statement on the TV shows.
And of course, the other line from that hearing when he said that his jaw dropped when he heard Ambassador Rice on those Sunday morning programs.
A lot of people said the same thing. They did not know of any evidence about the protests in the YouTube video. He was involved firsthand, had never reported such a thing. Ambassador Stevens in the phone call to the embassy from Benghazi to Tripoli had never said such a thing. Hicks says he's confident if there had been any sort of protest, the protocol would have been for Stevens to immediately notify them and evacuate the embassy. So Hicks at least is confident that didn't happen. So imagine their surprise when they hear Ambassador Rice saying these things. And Hicks was also very worried about offending Libya's leader, who was on Face the Nation saying quite the opposite, saying what we now know to be the truth, that this was probably motivated by a terrorist attack, motivated by terrorism. And he says rule one in diplomatic circles is you don't contradict your host country like that. So that was considered something I know less about, but in the diplomatic world, a big faux pas, apparently, the ambassador to be saying one thing that so strongly contradicted Libya's leader, especially when what we were saying, there was less evidence for that than what he was saying.
And you broke the story of Hillary Clinton traveling to Bosnia during the campaign of 2008, because you were on the trip back in 1995.
Right.
Explain what happened.
We went on a trip back in, was that 95? I didn't look at my notes. I think maybe it was 96, but
96.
I'm not sure.
Mid-1990s.
Okay, long time ago. And we did go to Bosnia. Chelsea Clinton was with us, and it was a good trip. She was seeing the troops. In fact, she went further into the demilitarized zone than her husband, the president, had been at that point. So it was an interesting trip. We did, there was some potential problem for danger there just because people could be firing at you. I mean, it was unlikely, but they did warn us when we were landing of certain things that you might do, and we did things such as an assault landing, an assault takeoff, style takeoff, just for extra safety, that sort of thing. But there was no encounters, there were no dangers in the end. And then many years later, when she was running for president, I guess she was telling a story about how she had dodged sniper fire in Bosnia. And I came home from an overseas trip, and it was my husband who said, "You know that trip you went on, did you get shot at?" And I said, "No, we didn't get shot at." And he said, "Well, Mrs. Clinton is giving speeches and saying you all were shot at." And I said, "Well, she must be talking about a different trip, because we definitely didn't get shot at, and certainly if there was any risk at all, they wouldn't have had us land. We weren't on a mandatory trip. Chelsea Clinton was on the plane with us. They wouldn't force a landing in a dangerous situation. We would fly somewhere else." And in fact, when we landed, it was so safe that we lingered on the runway. Mrs. Clinton visited with local school children who were on the runway, took photographs with the troops that were there. But in her account that she was giving, she said that she had dodged bullets and that they had had to duck and run to the car. I looked through my files, and we have the video still from that day. So we were able to show that there was nothing of the sort happening. And I didn't go looking for that story. I wasn't covering politics. I don't really like covering politics. But that one I had to do that one. It kind of fell in my lap because I was on the trip.
So let me conclude with the Benghazi hearings, 5.5 hours of testimony this past week. Where does this go next? What are you looking at, both the political side but also the investigative side?
Well, politically, I just think I can't even begin to predict what happens and who decides to whose advantage this is, or when maybe it's too much and how far it goes. But investigative-wise, I believe the ARB authors will be called back before Congress to answer some questions, and I think
Ambassador Pickering and others.
Yes, and Mueller, and I think both Democrats and Republicans have said they have questions. So that may indeed happen. There are a lot of other ground-level whistleblowers who are talking to people like me and people in Congress who are not yet ready to come forward. But there are people in the CIA, the Defense Department, and other State Department officials who have more to say. They don't always tell me what they have to say, because some of it they can't. It's classified, or it's secret, or they're not comfortable saying so. But they simply say there is more to the story. So I think if we keep going on this, we might find out more information that we don't know today.
Sharyl Attkisson of CBS News, you've always been gracious with your time coming on C-SPAN. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Please come back again.